Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to start adding in some of that oxidization that we were seeing previously so that we could actually start getting some of this kind of green tint showing up on our mesh. So let's just come over here and let's add in another fill layer. And also, let's make this into a group. Control G to group that. And the reason that we want to do this is because I want to have a few more layers to this oxidization. As you remember seeing, there was a little bit of that brown or that sort of greenish tone that was sitting on top of the rest of the surface here. So again, I'm going to set that to a pretty dark tone. In fact, I'm going to actually just keep this relatively dark, relatively desaturated, and I don't really want to set it to anything like a multiply. I don't want it to take on the underlying colors too much. I kind of want it to just be its own thing, just a bit darker than everything else. So for me, what that's going to mean is just kind of not changing any of this, but getting rid of height and metal and normal. And in this case, actually metal we're going to keep on because technically this oxidization starts to corrode the metal and it starts to come basically not metallic. So its rendering is going to be a little bit different than the other pieces. And it is going to be a very rough surface. Not too rough, but very. Let's just see. I do want to see some kind of highlights coming off of this in some way. So I want to see how the light's going to bounce off of that. It's a little bit too much at the moment. That starts to work pretty decent in here. I can kind of see how that's working. And in this case, I could go part metal, but again, you don't really want to do that with rendering. So that works out pretty decent. I can still see some shininess to this, and that'll work pretty good. We'll see how it works when we start to remove some more of this. So let's just add a black mask, and let's add a generator, and let's add one of the ones that I like quite a bit, which is dirt. So what dirt will do is start to kind of just build up some grunge into some of these surfaces. And it works out pretty darn well most of the time. As you can see here, it's kind of just going into those crevices pretty intensely. It starts to really look like dirt, which works well for us as well. Now, I could decrease some of that dirt level or increase some of that contrast of it, because I think that's what I'm going to want in this case. The grunge amount, I don't want there to be too much of it. It's pretty good, but it's not necessarily exactly what I want in this case. The grunge scale, again, some of the scales in some of these things tend to differ a little bit too much, which is a bit of a problem. Now, I do want to also turn up edge masking, because I do want to basically make sure that this doesn't go onto edges very much at all. But basically just crevices. So in this case, this is actually working out pretty well. We could start to increase this just a little bit more, maybe go up in that dirt level a little bit. That's pretty good. Increase that dirt contrast. Now, if you were not totally sure, again, you could look in here, see the kind of result that we're getting. We could, of course, do certain things like adding in a levels if you wanted to, or a filter. Do a thing like a blur, go much lower on that blur intensity. We just want just a little bit of a softening, and you could go into our levels and kind of just increase some of that contrast there. Probably not in that direction, but maybe a little bit this way, so that we're kind of just maintaining a little bit more of that black there. So that means that we start to get a little bit more buildup through here, which of course we could remove with a bit of a fill. So in this case, this fill could be just something that's going to kind of remove a bit of information just to kind of make things a little bit more interesting. So in this case, I'm just looking for big shapes from a grunge. So grunge 07 would work great for this. So let's just drop that in here. And in this case, I want to set this to something just like subtract. So basically what it'll do is just cut away from some of that existing grunge, still leaving it in certain pockets for us, but not necessarily so intense absolutely everywhere else. Now we could randomize this, just look for something with a little bit more black, or kind of darken some of this here so that the effect is not quite as pronounced as it was before, and even in this case still lower that intensity just a little bit here so that we get some variation, some kind of stuff popping away from it. Maybe even bring that balance back up just a little bit so the effect is just a little bit more pronounced, but not too much. And I think that'll work out pretty darn well. So now what we want to add in is some of those little bright values. Now, one thing I do want to do here is actually this layer itself, I don't need to be a mask just on this one spot. Let's just copy this mask, copy mask, and right click up here, create a black mask, and just paste into mask. It'll paste all of those different settings I was working with in there, and I can basically just clear this mask. I really don't need it anymore. Clear mask, all of that information's gone. I can shift click to kind of turn that mask off entirely so that I only have this showing up here. Next, I can drop in a new layer, one that has some of that kind of bright green kind of color that we were seeing previously. Something still fairly yellow. That's pretty good. And again, we don't want it to be metal, we don't want it to have a normal, but this one can actually have a height to it if we want. And in fact, its roughness, let's go to full rough on something like this. Maybe just down ever so slightly, but also a little bit of a bump up. That'll mean that whatever we create here is going to actually pop up out of that surface and create something a little bit more interesting for us. Now again, we're going to go add in a black mask. And here we want to start working with something that's going to work a little bit better. So I actually just want to copy in the existing mask that we've already got. So in this case, we just go paste into mask. And now I can start kind of affecting some of this a little bit more. So for example, this piece, we could randomize again. In fact, we could increase its balance quite a bit more and its contrast and crank some of those settings up so that those little spots start to only show up just a little bit in here. Next, we could take that blur, increase it just a little bit more, and crank up those levels so that we get a very different kind of result out of this. Certain little spots are going to start showing up in little crevices and break up a bit more than we had before. Let's just bring down that blur a little bit because we're starting to lose some shape in certain areas here, which is not quite what we want. We could also lower that dirt level a little bit more so that we're only getting this kind of stuff showing up just in a little bit of those crevices. You can start to see it through here a little bit better, where it's just going to be a gradual buildup. Just little bits of that kind of information showing up in here, which is a little bit closer to what we want. And lastly, again, we could potentially just kind of fiddle with some of these settings just to kind of get the look that we're going for. If we wanted to just lower this just a little bit more here, yeah, there we go. You start to see now that we've got basically a little bit of that darkness across that edge to show the kind of decay that we're getting, and then a little bit of that buildup of this green sort of accent to it, where the stuff has really started to decay a little bit more. Then we could randomize this a bit more to get more of an interesting shape, if that's not quite giving us what we want in the first place. But overall, that's probably going to work pretty decent. There we go. That works out. That works out pretty good. If we wanted a larger scale variation, we could add in just one more kind of fill and grunge just to kind of break up those larger surfaces. But I think in this case, it's working out pretty decent. We get a little bit of that kind of oxidization buildup in here and just some of those crevices, and it looks pretty convincing. And so that's about it. That's all we really need to do to start building up some of those basic textures in here and getting this looking pretty darn convincing for a metal. So the next thing we're going to want to do for our next module is to start refining this texture, kind of finishing it out and making it look really complete in its entirety.